Before Dracula became the face of the vampire, people were already afraid of something that came at night, attacked the body, and fed on human weakness. But the vampire did not begin as one clear creature. It was not always a nobleman in a castle. It did not always sleep in a coffin. It did not always turn into a bat. Those details came much later. The older fear was more basic. Something unseen or half-seen could come close to the living and take something from them. Blood, breath, strength, children, life itself. This is why the history of vampires does not start with one monster. It starts with a pattern. Across different cultures, we find beings connected with night, disease, death, childbirth, sexuality, the dead returning, and the fear that life can be drained away. These early creatures were not always vampires in the modern sense, but they carried many of the ideas that would later become part of vampire mythology. One of the oldest examples comes from Mesopotamia. In ancient Mesopotamian belief, the demon Lamashtu was especially feared by pregnant women, mothers, and infants. She was not a vampire like Dracula, but she belonged to the same dark family of fears. A supernatural being that threatened vulnerable bodies and attacked life at its weakest point. Lamashtu was associated with miscarriage, infant sickness, and the death of newborn children. In surviving amulets, she is shown as a monstrous female figure, often with animal features. These images were not made for decoration. They were used for protection. The goal was to name the danger and keep it away. This is important because many early vampire-like myths are connected to the same human fears. Illness that appears suddenly, children dying without explanation, and the feeling that some invisible force has entered the home. In the Greek world, we find another important figure, Lamia. Lamia was often described as a dangerous female, being connected with the killing or devouring of children. In later traditions, she also became associated with seduction and the destruction of young men. Like Lamashtu, Lamia shows how ancient cultures often connected supernatural horror with motherhood, children, sexuality, and death. She was not simply a monster with fangs. She was a way to explain a fear that was already there. The fear that something could come in the night and take the young, the weak, or the careless. Another Greek figure is Empusa, or Empusa. Empusa appears in ancient sources as a frightening female being connected with Hecate, the goddess associated with magic, crossroads, ghosts, and the night. In some traditions, Empusa could appear in a seductive form and attack young men. Later writers connected her with blood, flesh, and dangerous desire. This is one of the key steps toward the vampire idea. The monster is no longer only a beast. It can appear attractive. It can approach through desire. It can hide danger behind beauty. That idea becomes central to the modern vampire much later. Dracula, Carmilla, and many later vampires are terrifying not only because they kill, but because they attract. They do not always attack like wild animals. Sometimes they invite, seduce, and slowly destroy. The Romans had their own night creature, the strix. The strix was often imagined as a night bird, or owl-like monster associated with bad omens, witchcraft, infants, and the feeding on human flesh or blood. The word itself is connected to later ideas of witches and night-feeding creatures. Again, this is not the polished vampire of Gothic fiction. It is older and rougher. A night thing, a child killer, a creature linked with fear around the sleeping body. When we look at Lamashtu, Lamia, Empusa, and the Strix, we are not looking at one direct line that leads neatly to Dracula. We are looking at pieces, the child-killing demon, the night visitor, the seductive destroyer, the creature that feeds on blood or flesh, the supernatural explanation for sickness and sudden death. These pieces appear in different cultures at different times under different names, but together they show that the vampire was not invented from nothing. The vampire was built from older fears that humans had carried for centuries. Before the vampire became elegant, it was something much darker. It was a sickness with a name, a shadow near the bed, a woman who was not fully human, a bird that came at night, a force that took life from the living. Dracula made the vampire famous, but long before Dracula, the world already had reasons to fear what came after sunset. The ancient creatures we talked about before were not vampires in the modern sense. Lamashtu, Lamia, Empusa, and the Strix carried pieces of the vampire idea, but the real shift happens when the monster becomes a corpse, not just a demon, not just a night spirit, a dead body that comes back. This is where the vampire begins to look more familiar. In European folklore, especially in Slavic and Balkan traditions, one of the most important ideas is the revenant. A revenant is a dead person believed to return from the grave and disturb the living. Sometimes it appears as a ghost, but in vampire folklore, the revenant is often more physical. It is the corpse itself that becomes dangerous. This is very different from Dracula. The folkloric vampire was usually not elegant, rich, or mysterious. It was often a dead villager, a family member, a neighbor, or someone who had died under suspicious or abnormal circumstances. The fear was not that a stranger in a castle would seduce you. The fear was that someone buried nearby was not fully gone. Folklorist Jan Perkowski, one of the major scholars of Slavic vampire belief, studied how these traditions were connected to local ideas about death, burial, community, and pollution. In many Slavic traditions, the vampire was not simply a blood-drinking monster. It was a sign that something had gone wrong between the living and the dead. A person might be suspected of becoming a vampire if they died violently, died by suicide, were excommunicated, practiced witchcraft, or were buried improperly. In some regions, even being born with unusual signs, such as teeth or a caul, could make people suspicious. The point was not only the body itself, it was the idea of a life or death that did not fit the expected order. When that order broke, people feared the dead might return. This is also why vampire belief was often connected to disease. If several people in one household or village died one after another, the community looked for a cause. Before modern germ theory, repeated deaths could look like an attack. The dead person was imagined as draining the life of the living, especially relatives. Paul Barber, in his influential book Vampires, Burial, and Death, argues that many classic vampire signs can be explained through the natural process of decomposition. When bodies were exhumed, villagers might find bloating, darkened skin, blood around the mouth, or hair and nails that appeared to have grown. To people without modern forensic knowledge, these signs could look like proof that the corpse had been feeding. The body looked too fresh. The mouth seemed stained with blood. The stomach looked full. So the conclusion was terrifying but logical within that worldview. The dead person had been leaving the grave. This helps explain why anti-vampire rituals focused so much on the corpse. People did not only pray against the vampire, they opened graves, they inspected bodies. They used stakes, decapitation, burning, stones, sickles, and other methods meant to stop the dead from returning. The goal was simple: keep the corpse in the grave, stop it from moving, cut the link between the dead and the living. This belief became especially famous in the 18th century, when vampire cases from Eastern Europe reached Western Europe through reports, newspapers, and official investigations. One of the most famous cases was Peter Plagojevich, a Serbian villager who died in 1725. After his death, several people in his village were said to have died after claiming that Plagojevich had visited them. His body was exhumed, and the condition of the corpse was interpreted as proof of vampirism. Another famous case was Arnold Pauli, also connected with Serbia. Reports about Pauli and later deaths in the village of Medveja became part of the 18th century vampire panic. Austrian officials and military doctors became involved, and their reports helped spread vampire belief among educated Europeans. This is an important moment in vampire history. The vampire was no longer only a local village fear. It became a European controversy. Doctors, priests, officials, philosophers, and writers all began discussing whether these reports were superstition, disease, fraud, or something unknown. The vampire entered newspapers and learned debates before it fully entered Gothic fiction. And again, this vampire was not Dracula. It was rougher, more physical, more connected to the grave. The folkloric vampire was not mainly about romance. It was about death that refused to stay dead. It was about a corpse that still seemed active. It was about disease moving through families. It was about the fear that burial had failed. This is why the vampire became such a powerful figure. It stood at the exact place where human certainty breaks down. The living know what death is supposed to mean. A body stops moving, a grave closes, a person is gone. But vampire folklore asks a darker question. What if death does not finish the body? What if the person buried under the ground is still somehow feeding on the world above? That idea is much closer to the vampire we recognize today. Not because of the cape, the castle, or the fangs, but because of the central fear: the dead returning to drain the living. Before Dracula became a legend, the vampire was already rising from village graves, spreading through rumor, disease, and official reports. And the most disturbing part is that people did not fear the vampire because it was impossible. They feared it because, to them, the evidence was already in the ground. By the 18th century, the vampire had moved from village graves into European debate. Reports from Eastern Europe were no longer just local rumors. They were being written down, translated, discussed, and questioned by officials, doctors, priests, and scholars. One important example is Dom Augustin Calmet, a French Benedictine scholar who wrote about spirits, revenants, and vampires in the 18th century. Calmet did not create the vampire myth, but his work helped bring these stories into educated European discussion. The vampire was becoming more than folklore. It was becoming a subject of argument. Was it superstition? Was it disease? Was it fraud? Or was there something about death that people still did not understand? This is an important turning point. The vampire was still connected to the grave, the corpse, and the fear of disease. But it was also becoming material for literature. In 1819, John Polidori published The Vampire. This story changed the direction of vampire fiction. Polidori's vampire, Lord Ruthven, was not a rotting corpse from a village grave. He was aristocratic, intelligent, cold, and socially dangerous. This is one of the biggest shifts in vampire history. The monster moved from the cemetery to the drawing room. Instead of a dead neighbor rising from the ground, the vampire became a mysterious nobleman who could enter polite society. He did not only threaten the body, he threatened reputation, desire, morality, and trust. That version of the vampire would become extremely important. Later in the 19th century, vampire fiction continued to develop through works like Varney the Vampire, published as a penny dreadful between 1845 and 1847. Varney helped popularize many features that later audiences would recognize. Fangs, attacks on sleeping women, marks on the neck, hypnotic power, and the vampire as a cursed, dramatic figure. The vampire was changing again. It was no longer only a symbol of disease and death. It was becoming a character, a villain, a seducer, a cursed outsider, a being that could frighten people but also fascinate them. Then came Carmilla, written by Sheridan Le Fanu and published in the 1870s. Carmilla is one of the most important vampire stories before Dracula. It introduced a more intimate, psychological form of vampire horror. The vampire was not only an invader from outside, she could become close. She could be charming, emotional, and disturbing at the same time. This was another major step toward the modern vampire. The monster was no longer just attacking from the dark. It could become part of someone's private life. It could appear beautiful. It could create attachment before destruction. Finally, in 1897, Bram Stoker published Dracula. Dracula did not invent the vampire. That is the key point. What Stoker did was combine many older elements into one powerful figure. From folklore, he took the undead body, the grave, blood, fear of contamination, and the idea that the dead could feed on the living. From earlier fiction, he inherited the aristocratic vampire, the seductive danger, the attack in the bedroom, and the mysterious foreign nobleman. Stoker also drew from 19th century fears: disease, immigration, sexuality, degeneration, science, religion, and the anxiety that ancient evil could enter the modern world. That is why Dracula became so powerful. He was not just one monster. He was a collection of older fears wearing one face. Behind Dracula, there are village corpses. Behind him, there are plague fears and burial rituals. Behind him, there are revenants, night spirits, child-killing demons, seductive destroyers, and centuries of stories about the dead returning to drain the living. This is why the vampire survived when so many other monsters faded. The vampire can change shape because the fear behind it is simple and old. We fear death. We fear disease. We fear the body after life has left it. We fear desire when it becomes dangerous. We fear losing strength to something we cannot see. And we fear the idea that what is buried might not stay buried. From Lamashtu, Lamia, Empusa, and the Strix, to Slavic revenants, 18th century vampire panics, Polidori's Lord Ruthven, Le Fanu's Carmilla, and Stoker's Dracula, the vampire was built slowly over time. It was not born in one book. It was assembled from ancient fears. So when we see Dracula standing in his castle, we are not looking at the beginning of the vampire. We are looking at the final mask of something much older. Before the cape, before the coffin, before the castle, there was a simpler terror. The dead were not always silent, and the night was not always empty.